This message comes from Capital One. Your business faces unique challenges and opportunities. That's why Capital One offers a comprehensive suite of financial services backed by the strength of a top 10 commercial bank. Visit CapitalOne.com/commercial. Member FDIC.
Hello, hello. I'm Brittany Luse, and you're listening to It's Been a Minute from NPR, a show about what's going on in culture and why it doesn't happen by accident. November is National Adoption Awareness Month. And no, it's not one of those made-up holidays like National Nacho Day. It's a real thing. President Bill Clinton personally declared it a national priority in 1995.
As we celebrate National Adoption Month, Americans can take pride in the progress we're making, but we know there is much more work to be done.
And as a culture, we love to celebrate adoption stories. They paint a beautiful picture of a child in need going to a loving family. Sometimes those stories transcend race and identity. I'm looking at you, Angelina Jolie. But lately, the narrative around adoption has been shifting from the perfect Hollywood happy ending to something a little more complicated. There's a whole community of adoptees online talking about their experiences. On TikTok, there are over 50 million videos tagged adoptee.
I think it's really important to remember that in private infant adoption, it always begins with loss for the baby.
3 things I wish adopters understood about adoptees. Number 1, the adoptee experience is literally so complex because we're grateful that we have a family, sure, but we can also resent the fact that we are with you to begin with.
There's a popular term some adoptees use for becoming more critical of adoption or for facing the grief within their adoption story. It's called coming out of the fog. And birth parents are weighing in too.
It was my experience with adoption that caused me to start to rethink everything that was told to me about adoption because I was now living it. None of what was panning out after the, signing away my parental rights was the story that I was told about what adoption would be like for me.
Today on It's Been a Minute, we're taking a closer look at how adoption functions in our culture. We're zooming in on one side of the adoption triangle, the birth parents. We're diving deep into how the stories that are told about birth parents stack up against their realities, and ultimately asking, how does our culture decide who deserves to be a parent? I'm joined by Gretchen Sisson, the author of Relinquished, The Politics of Adoption and the Privilege of American Motherhood. She'll be taking us through her research with birth parents. Gretchen, welcome to It's Been a Minute.
Thanks for having me, Brittany.
I first want to talk to you about where we see adoption in pop culture, because you mentioned a few major pop culture moments about adoption in your book. What are they, and what narrative of adoption are they getting across?
So one of the ones that people recognize most immediately when I tell them I do work with relinquishing mothers, with birth mothers, is Juno.
Right, the 2007 indie classic about a teen mom, played by Elliot Page.
Right, Juno comes up often, and a lot of the mothers that I interviewed really hated Juno and really rejected this idea that mothers who relinquished their infants were kind of just immediately moving on with their life and didn't want to have an ongoing connection or knowledge of their child the way that it's portrayed in that film.
I'm pregnant.
Oh, God.
Yeah, but I'm going to give it up for adoption. 30-odd weeks, we can just pretend that this never happened.
That was really uncomfortable for them. They also had some logistical concerns about Juno riding a bike so soon after labor and delivery, which I share with them.
Right. You say that in reality, a lot of birth parents want to know the person they brought into the world. One study from 10 years ago found that 95% of adoptions had some level of openness, meaning there's some identifying information that birth parents and adoptive parents receive about one another. And almost half of all adoptions at the same time had plans for ongoing contact between the birth family and the adopted family. That's something I think we see a bit more clearly in the MTV reality show, 16 and Pregnant. I think many of us remember, especially millennials, watching Caitlin and Tyler on that show.
Hi, my name is Caitlin. I'm 16 and I'm from Algonac, Michigan, a small town right.
They had an open adoption that played out on 16 and Pregnant. And this couple is still together today with more kids they've raised themselves, which you can watch unfold on the spinoff show Teen Mom. Could you talk to me about their story and what you think that communicates?
Yeah, I think Caitlin and Tyler's story is so important. And I think you're right. For people of our generation, this was really a crucial pop cultural moment. They were in a really optimistic place early in their adoption, right? They believed that what they had chosen was best for their child, was best for them. And they had, Dr. Drew on the couch next to them telling them that they were more mature, more responsible, better parents for having relinquished their child.
Right.
Such a courageous decision, both of you.
Thank you.
How did you do it?
Her?
Yeah.
Just, okay,
It's not about you anymore.
It's not,
Yeah, but at 17, everything's about you.
when you have a baby that's not about you, you can't.
You gotta
It's
grow
about
up.
Yeah.
Do you understand how extraordinary that is, that you guys were able to do that?
Well, I hear it a lot, but
I feel so passionately that people like you need to be honored, and because it's so difficult.
And I think that is a narrative that we have never really pulled apart. The idea that they are better parents by virtue of disclaiming their parenthood, terminating their parenthood, has made them more worthy of their child. They feel very differently about their adoption today than they did when you go back and you rewatch that first season of 16 and Pregnant.
We're almost 30 now, and we still feel like this inferior position.
I see it in what you're saying.
and it's because in the snap of a finger, they can take everything away.
Caitlin and Tyler's journey reflects a lot of the mothers that I spoke with, right? So most of the mothers that I interviewed over 10 years came to a far more critical place around their adoption. They saw, like Caitlin and Tyler have seen, that this open adoption doesn't deliver on the promises that were made to them at the time. I remember Caitlin and Tyler not feeling that loving connection to the adoptive family that they had been counseled on during Caitlin's pregnancy.
The communication with her adoptive parents, Brianna and Teresa, has always been complicated.
The baby, she is our child.
Absolutely.
And you have to trust our decisions.
A lot of the mothers that I interviewed in 2010 felt really positively about their adoptions at the time. But when I went back and interviewed them 10 years later, most of them had come to a harder place for them, a more critical understanding of their adoption. They had less contact with their child than they wanted or than they had been led to expect they would get.
Right.
That was really common in the stories that I heard from mothers who wanted what they had been told to expect at the time of the adoption.
Something that I didn't understand really until we started to actually research is how in a lot of states, open adoptions are not legally enforceable.
That doesn't mean that the mothers understand that when they sign these openness agreements. They believe they're signing a binding contract. But even in cases where they are legally binding, the relinquishing mother does not have a lot of power if the adoptive parents choose not to follow that agreement. It would require going to court. It would require getting a judicial order. A lot of these mothers don't have the resources for that.
Coming up, why there is so much public investment in adoption and how parental worthiness gets decided. Stick around.
This message comes from BetterHelp. It's important to take time to show gratitude towards others, but it's equally important to thank yourself. Life throws a lot of curveballs, and being grateful isn't always easy. Therapy can help remind you of all that you're worthy of and all that you do have. Let the gratitude flow with BetterHelp. Try at betterhelp.com/NPR today to get 10% off your first month.
This message comes from Capital One, offering commercial solutions you can bank on. Now more than ever, your business faces unique challenges and opportunities. That's why Capital One offers a comprehensive suite of financial services, all tailored to your short and long-term goals. Backed by the strength and stability of a top 10 commercial bank, their dedicated experts work with you to build lasting success. Explore the possibilities at CapitalOne.com/commercial, a member FDIC. This message comes from ADP. ADP knows any new technology, any old competitor, any trendy thing, Even a trendy thing that everyone knows isn't a great idea, but management just wants us to give it a try for a bit, can change the world of work. So, whether it's a last-minute policy change or adding a new company holiday, ADP designs forward-thinking solutions to help businesses take on the next anything. ADP, always designing for people.
So we talked about some of the aftermath for birth parents who choose to enter into an adoption, but I want to back up a bit and talk about how the decision to relinquish gets made. We saw in the Dobbs decision in 2022, the decision that overturned Roe versus Wade, that judges and lawmakers are thinking about abortion and adoption as substitutes, like during the opening arguments. Justice Amy Coney Barrett suggested having baby boxes that birth parents could leave babies in with no consequences. These are called safe havens. She was suggesting that should take care of the issue of not getting an abortion.
You and many of your amici focus on the ways in which the forced parenting, forced motherhood would hinder women's access to the workplace and to equal opportunities. Why don't the safe haven laws take care of that problem? It seems to me that it focuses the burden.
And Justice Samuel Alito said in his opinion on the Dobbs decision that a woman who puts her newborn up for adoption today has little reason to fear that the baby will not find a suitable home. But do people who are pregnant see it that way? Like, why do they choose adoption?
So there has never been comparable rates of abortion and adoption, right? Abortion is a very common experience. Relinquishment is a relatively rare one. And this is true even when you look back pre-Roe v. Wade. Even when abortion was illegal and adoption was extremely coercive, secretive, this is the peak of domestic adoptions, you still had more abortions than you did adoptions at the time. But I think that what the justices are suggesting, that people don't need access to abortion because adoption exists, fundamentally misunderstands, one, how people make pregnancy decisions, and two, the reasons that they might relinquish. So people don't make pregnancy decisions choosing between abortion and adoption. They're choosing between abortion and staying pregnant. People who seek abortion are fundamentally uninterested in adoption. There was one survey of abortion patients that asked them if they were interested in adoption, and 99% said no. 1% said kind of. 0% said yes, right? People who want abortions just are not interested in adoption. But most of the mothers that I interviewed who went on to relinquish, they wanted to parent. Most of them didn't consider having an abortion. They continued their pregnancies because they intended to raise this child. And it wasn't until either an accumulated series of crises or a major breaking point happened where parenting felt impossible. So that's what we know about how people make pregnancy decisions. They're not choosing between abortion and adoption. And we know that they're not relinquishing because they couldn't get an abortion necessarily. So when we did a study of people who were denied access to abortion care, 91% of those who were forced to continue the pregnancy because they couldn't get an abortion, 91% of them were parenting. Only 9% were relinquishing. Now that 9% is meaningful compared to the 0.5% of overall births that are relinquished. So if you constrain people's choices, if you deny abortion access, if you make parenting impossible, people will relinquish because they don't have another path.
Right. And it's still a bit early to say what impact Dobbs has had on adoption rates, but some adoption agencies in states where abortion is more restricted have said they're getting more interest.
But they are not generally relinquishing just because they were denied abortion care. We are going to have far, far more people parenting in circumstances that they didn't choose as a result of abortion denial than we are going to have an increase in adoptions.
Well, it's interesting, though, even outside of how adoption played a part in the Dobbs decision, politicians on both sides of the aisle push for adoption. Last year, Democratic Senator Amy Klobuchar and Republican Senator Kevin Cramer brought a bipartisan bill to raise adoption awareness and support adopted families to the Senate. Also, millions of dollars of government funding in several states go towards promoting adoption, either directly or as a part of their alternatives to abortion programs. What's with all this investment in adoption?
Oh, because if it worked, it would be so easy and clean, right? Adoption is an easier solution than actually addressing the root causes of inequality, of poverty, of family separation in our country. Introducing a private solution is straightforward from a policy perspective. But we put a lot of money into upholding adoption. The federal adoption tax credit, which applies to both public and private adoptions, is almost $16,000 per adoption.
Right. That's basically a government refund for some of the money people might have spent on an adoption, which averages between $20,000 to $40,000 per adoption.
That's in addition to state subsidies, which are mostly in the public adoption space, but those exist as well, in addition to state funding that can go to crisis pregnancy centers that partner with adoption agencies, that encourage referrals for adoption agencies. So all of this is public money that is really going into a system that involves transferring babies largely from poor families and communities to families with more socioeconomic status and affluence. That's a refrain that I keep coming back to. I think this is just an easier way of saying we don't need to make these public investments in vulnerable families.
You know, something I think that goes unsaid a little that you're starting to say here is that the idea of who deserves to be a parent and who has a right to be a parent is oftentimes paired with financial stability. What does it mean to be a quote unquote worthy parent in our culture?
I think that Americans just fundamentally do not see poor people as worthy parents. And I think that that is really the defining characteristic of adoption today. It used to be about different things, right? So when you look back at private adoption before Roe versus Wade, most relinquishing mothers at the time were young, white, middle-class girls and young women. And the adoption was a way of delaying parenthood until they could be married. We didn't see that same pattern of relinquishment in communities of color. I want to be clear, they were not protected from family separation. It just wasn't occurring within the private adoption system.
One of the things that stuck out to me in your book is that relinquishing mothers and their children have become less white over time, but 77% of all adoptive parents are white. I read that while white babies are adopted at the highest percentage, almost 30% of adoptions are now transracial. How did that happen?
What happened was the supply of infants was very low. And that's when you see the increase in international adoption really take off through the 90s, peaked in 2004, and then fell pretty quickly. You saw white families adopting children of color in a meaningful number. And today, you see pretty high demand for any healthy babies. And I think that that has also allowed the targeting of more Black and Brown American women for domestic adoption as well, which is what we're seeing in Texas now.
Yes, I was reading about this. In Texas, there is a promotional campaign basically arguing that or trying to frame adoption as a way that women can be empowered to be in control of their future. I mean, this is something that's happening after, abortion has been banned in nearly all circumstances in the state of Texas. And these ads and this marketing is being targeted to women who have the potential to be convinced to become relinquishing mothers.
This is a state-funded campaign, right? This campaign, the Modern Adoption Campaign, came directly out of Texas's publicly funded Alternatives to Abortion program. Mm-hmm. This is what they're going to offer people in lieu of abortion access, is they're going to tell them that adoption is this really empowering option. It's intentionally targeted to Black and Brown communities. Texas has decided to put millions of dollars into this public-private partnership to sell the idea of adoption to people who are facing crisis pregnancies.
So we've talked about how adoption is not always the desired outcome for relinquishing parents, but some adoptees have also been expressing grief online about their adoptions. We talked to a few of them. Here are adoptees Tori Bay, Angela Tucker, and Nicole Egbrett.
The narrative of adoption for most of our life has been so positive. And then you realize that there is a lot of grief to unpack. There is a lot of loss to unpack and to come to terms with. And there may be some animosity towards people or systems. A lot of the times, society will say that you're just so angry. You're such an angry adoptee. Like, adoption gave you everything.
I think early on, I bought into the notion that my birth mother could not care for me. But the only fact we really knew was that she struggled with homelessness. And so it was easy for me to equate poverty with not being a good parent until I started looking into that and understanding the systemic issues that lead to poverty, especially for Black families. And it's really frustrating for adoptees to have communities around them that say, your birth mom loved you so much, she chose adoption for you, when we all know that every adoption should have some sort of complexity at its root.
In some ways, and I mean this with no judgment, it's easier to just tell oneself that, like, this is a happy ending. I should feel grateful, nothing's wrong and everything's okay. And, releasing that and starting to actually dig in to these really painful feelings of grief, it hurts. And for me, it was essential to do that in community with other adoptees.
And there's some pretty consistent evidence that adopted people are more likely to experience mental health issues and behavioral problems than the general population. There's a quote that you mentioned in the book. Can young people receive the care they need without being made a legal stranger to their families? Talk to me more about that question.
None of what I argue, when I'm critical of adoption, none of what I am suggesting is that we should be imposing parenthood on people who don't want it, that we don't need more people to love and care about children in our society, or that every person is equipped to raise every child to whom they give birth at every point in their lives. One of the stories that I include in my book is a mother who dealt with postpartum psychosis. She'd raised 3 other children. She knew that she could successfully parent. She would be the first to say that she wasn't a safe parent for that baby at that time. She didn't have her own interpersonal support network. She didn't trust the foster care system, particularly as a Black woman. She was worried that she'd lose custody of all of her children if she relied on that as a way of caring for her baby while she got the psychiatric support that she needed. And she ended up relinquishing the baby for private adoption. She permanently ended their relationship when there are myriad temporary solutions that could have kept their legal relationship intact, right? And I start with that story because it is really uncomfortable. I mean, she talked about these intrusive thoughts of harming the baby, right? This is not a person that you want caring for this child on her own at this point in time. But there wasn't a type of crisis care, that there wasn't a way of fostering that she could feel safe availing herself of until she could get the medical care that she needed to be in a safer place to care for her son. Right. And that's why I think it's really important for us to think more creatively about how we support families in parenting, in caring for children, and think about what children actually need and see a value in preserving the relationship between child and family of origin and community of origin, and think about how we are making investments in communities writ large, systems of support, rather than allowing this private industry that commodifies babies to provide our primary answer to these situations.
So there's been a lot of conversation about adoption, I think mainly because many adoptees are talking about their experiences online. I've seen suggestions made by some adoptees for how to make adoption different or better. Open adoptions are tricky, as we discussed, but some are saying making guardianship more common could be a solution, so someone else can care for a child without it ending the birth parent's legal relationship. But also, I want to bring in the third side of this triangle for a second. Adoptive parents. A recent survey found out that of those who have ever considered or are currently considering adopting, almost a quarter said it was because they experience fertility issues or other barriers to conceiving naturally. And that can be tough. All of the failed IVF treatments and the pregnancy losses and, negative one-step tests that often come with that can all be really, really painful. So many people dream of raising a child for their entire lives. And when that dream can't be realized, it's heartbreaking. In many cultures, it can also be stigmatizing too. So I get why adoption looks like a better option, but if we as a culture begin to place more emphasis on the right to parent the child you have, where does that leave people who can't have one naturally?
Before I started my work on adoption, I was studying infertility and how people were making decisions around what treatments to pursue. And often they are very flippantly told, like, oh, you should just adopt. Like, oh, this is going to be the answer to that struggle as well.
That's very much how it's framed, yeah.
Yeah. And we don't think about, well, what would it mean to educate people about their fertility? What if fertility education was part of sex education? What if sex education wasn't just about all of the scary things that pregnancy is so that you scare young people into abstinence? What if it was actually about educating people about how their bodies work, how fertility changes as you age, what it looks like? What if we provided space for people to access affordable medical treatments so that if their primary goal is to conceive, they can do that rather than creating additional demand within the private adoption system? But I do think that we need more people willing to engage as foster parents that don't have an interest in adopting, right? So I heard stories from mothers who found out that they were pregnant like at 39 weeks, right? And they weren't ready to parent, right? But they needed time to get themselves together. Mothers who are struggling with addiction, they're going to need people that they can rely on for care that don't have a primary motivation of adopting out of that system. And the foster care system has for a long time been viewed as just a less expensive option than the private adoption system. It is less expensive, it's more affordable, and people will engage with the foster care system because they want to adopt. We need more people that are willing to engage and provide care without the end goal being a formalized legal relationship. I know that's a tall ask for people, but it's also a tall ask for our culture to reconceive of who we're trying to serve ultimately and keeping it focused on a child's needs rather than an adult's desire.
Gretchen, thank you so much. I really appreciate this.
Thank you for having me, Brittany.
That was Gretchen Sisson, the author of Relinquished, The Politics of Adoption and the Privilege of American Motherhood. This episode of It's Been a Minute was produced by
Liam McBain.
This episode was edited by
Jessica Plachek.
Jasmine Romero.
Engineering support came from
Robert Rodriguez.
Our VP of Programming is
Yolanda Sanguini.
All right, that's all for this episode of It's Been a Minute from NPR. I'm Brittany Luse. Talk soon.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Merrill. Whatever your financial goals are, you want a straightforward path there. But the real world doesn't usually work that way. Merrill understands that. That's why, with a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan and a clear path forward. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer, registered investment advisor, member SIPC. This message comes from NPR sponsor Shopify, the global commerce platform that helps you sell and show up exactly the way you want to. Customize your online store to your style. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/NPR. Support for NPR and the following message come from GiveWell. Over 100,000 donors have used GiveWell to donate more than $1 billion. Find out more or make a donation at givewell.org. Select how you heard about GiveWell by choosing podcast and enter NPR at checkout.